Welcome to my class picking guide for Mists of Pandaria. Since we're now in the pre-patch on MoP and the launch is right around the corner, many people will be put in a position where they need to choose which class or classes to play come launch. With this video, I hope to be able to guide you in making that choice, such that you get the opportunity to enjoy the expansion to the fullest. Before we dive in, I want to make a quick disclaimer. So the material that I'm going to present in this guide is based on my personal opinions and findings which I made during the beta and the pre-patch up until this point. In terms of observations related to class performance and design, we're seeing frequent changes in the beta and pre-patch, so things can still change before or after the launch. But if you agree or disagree with some of the points, I would love to hear about it in the comment section. As you've probably already seen, this video is going to be on the longer side, so if there's a particular topic or class you're interested in, feel free to use the video chapters to jump around. If you do want to hear it all, you can simply lean back and enjoy the ride. Structurally, this video is going to be broken into several segments. First, I'm going to introduce some enjoyment factors which could be relevant in picking a class. Each class is then going to be analyzed according to these factors to provide an overview on if the class might be suitable for you or not. After that, I'll talk about each role a bit more in detail, comparing your alternatives to give a relative perspective within that role. Finally, I'm going to provide my subjective picks for the classes which I'm most excited to play. Now that you know what to expect from this video, what actually makes a class fun to play? I think we can all agree that we play the game for different reasons. Whether it's for pushing high parses or collecting achievements, the game offers something different for everyone. I want to introduce some factors which I could see bring enjoyment to a wide player base to establish a baseline of what we're actually discussing for each class alternative. The most misleading, but perhaps also most interesting factor for most players is going to be performance. How well does my future class stack up against the competition? Well, there is no objective truth to this question. I'll talk a bit about the predicted performance as a key enjoyment factor for each class. I'll also talk a bit about the complexity of the class, giving an indication for how hard it is to reach said performance. The third factor will be to discuss the utility toolkits of the class, basically give an insight into what buttons you can press outside of your standard offensive or defensive rotations, which can help yourself or your groups. To wrap it up, I'll add in a unit of analysis to discuss the usability of the class, where I'll go through some more soft features, such as how the class feels to play, how it fits into group content, and the flexibility of spec choices. Without further ado, let's talk about the classes in relation to these factors. We're going to start off by talking about the Druid. The Druid has seen some systematic changes going into MoP. The most glaring difference is that the class now has 4 unique specs which can fill any role. While this might seem like an obvious change, it changes the previous playstyle of form weaving such that you will now only essentially play in one form depending on which spec you've chosen. Across the board, the Druid class is expected to hold a high level of performance based on what's been shown so far. As a tank, the Guardian is currently underperforming and is looking like a weak pick in terms of specialization. The Feral and Balance specs are posting great numbers with a tendency to compete with the top specs in most situations. The Restoration spec is also showing a lot of promise during the pre-patch, being able to dish out some big numbers and could be a staple pick in many compositions due to its strengths. The complexity of the DPS spec lie in the ability to manage resources while keeping debuffs active on one or more targets, which causes them to have a high ceiling to master. On a similar note, the Restoration spec is quite difficult compared to many other healing classes, where you have to alternate between using HOTS and castable heals, such that your abilities can synergize with the Harmony effect. As with any aspect of the game, this does become easier with practice, but it's comparatively harder than some of the other specs available. As a stark contrast, the Guardian spec has been extremely simplified and is rated as one of the easiest specs to pick up among any class. In summary, whether you're on the newer side or if you find enjoyment in difficult specs, the Druid class is going to have something for you. While the class does have several dynamic elements to it and has received some additions, the Druid still struggles a bit in the utility department if we were to look at the PvE scene. Most of the utility that the Druid brings is related to soft CC or mobility. However, the new Symbiosis spell will provide a high degree of freedom to all specs, regardless of setting. If we were to talk about the usability, the class is in a strong state. There are 4 available specs with the opportunity to fill any role, and you're able to adapt to most settings by providing good value to most scenarios, if not all. While the fluency of gameplay has been lowered on the Feral side, the rotations still feel quite smooth, and there has been some nice quality of life changes to the class, which does pay tribute to the traditional Druid playstyle. On an overall level, it's an easy pick to say that the Druid is a great pick on a comparative scale to other classes. You can play the Druid in so many different ways and in so many different settings that it could be perceived as a really strong all-round class. I would expect that anyone who's still unsure about what to play could find enjoyment in playing Druid in some way, shape or form, especially if they keep tweaking the specs to match the changes made to other classes. Next, let's talk about the Paladin class. The Paladin retains much of its core identity going into MoP, with a variety of tools to assist your team regardless of which spec you were to play. One of the biggest changes is that you no longer have important auras and niche buffs, but rather a homogenized kit which feels similar to many other classes in MoP, which could make the class feel less special compared to previous expansions. In terms of performance, the Paladin is in a bit of a tumultuous period where it's less of an obvious pick than in the past. The previous Holy Paladin meta is shifting since the Holy Paladin are now among the weaker healing specs based on current balancing. They don't really fill a niche role in healing like they have before, but still retain a lot of their viability due to their other tools, rather than their sheer output. The Retribution spec is looking like it will be somewhere in the middle of the pack, with tendencies to pull towards the upper DPS bracket in single target scenarios with more stats, but it's not an obvious pick for an arbitrary composition. The Protection Paladin has gotten a lot of love in the pre-patch. Previously, they were anticipated to scale into the later parts of the expansion and start off as a weak pick. However, since Seal of Insight now gives a flat haste baseline, the previous threshold of having high haste to be a viable tank has drastically been lowered. In terms of numbers, the Prot Paladin is going to do good damage as a main tank, but might struggle in the numbers department as an off tank or in terms of healing done compared to some other tanks. The complexity of the class is fairly low if you only look at the rotational aspect of the class. All specs have a fairly straightforward builder and spender system, which should be easily picked up by anyone. However, the complexity rises to an intermediate level when factoring in all the abilities which you can press to help your team. In general, the trade-off between your standard rotation and using helpful spells is what makes the spec harder to master. In terms of utility, the Paladin is up there with the absolutely best classes in the game. The big difference going from Cataclysm is that all specs now share a wide assortment of utility spells such as Aura Mastery. Additionally, the shared talents also give the Paladin more flexibility in the use of their hand spells and some much needed movement speed additions. It's safe to say that you have a sure pick with the Paladin when it comes to utility, and you should have a tool for every situation which can help you or your team. Moving on to the usability of the class, in general I would say that the class feels great. The previous rotations could become quite one-dimensional, but with 5 holy power and extra buttons to press, it does start to feel a bit more dynamic and engaging to play. Apart from this, the previous bottleneck of movement is also addressed and makes the class feel a lot smoother than it has in the past. On an overall level, we do see quite a shift in terms of spec viability going into MoP, where Prot overtakes Holy as the probably most viable spec, and Ret stays somewhere in the middle. Due to the streamlining of the class playstyle and utility, I would say that the Paladin is a solid pickup for anyone who enjoys a dynamic class, which can be thrown into many different scenarios, and there should be a spot for Paladins due to their toolkit in most group content. Let's continue by taking a look at the newest kit on the block, being the Monk. The Monk brings one spec in each of the PvE roles and is a fast-paced class with a lot of dynamic elements to it. Despite the class being the newest addition, it feels refreshing and challenging in terms of class design, and it combines some good class design from the past into one dynamic package. The class also introduces a new dual resource system, being Chi and Energy, which is similar to the combo point system where you spend energy to generate Chi and spend Chi on strong abilities. In terms of performance, the Monk enters the scene on a decent level. Neither the Windwalker or the Mistweaver are looking to be top tier specs, but is projected to be somewhere in the middle of the pack in terms of output. On the other hand, the Brewmaster is looking like a great pick as either main or off tank. It can pump some solid DPS in both AoE and single target scenarios while staying healthy through it all. Also, the supportive features of being able to shield and heal your team really contributes to the power level of the spec. I would expect many groups to include a Brewmaster and for it to post some good performance throughout the expansion. The complexity of all the specs are quite high. The The DPS and tank specs are relying on going through your standard rotation while maintaining buffs and debuffs. In order to perform at a high level on either of these specs, there's quite a bit of resource and aura monitoring so that you press your buttons at the right time to optimize your efficiency. If you fail to do so, the performance of these two specs drop quite drastically, so it would be a safe bet to say that both of these specs are among the harder specs to perform with in this expansion. When it comes to the Mistweaver, we're at a similar state where we need to work a dual resource system to efficiently put out numbers. While weaving the standard rotation, the room for error is quite forgiving, but can be hard to master since there's a wide assortment of impactful buttons which will help you in getting the job done. In terms of utility, the Monk is on the upper levels of utility provided. All specs have great mobility and crowd control, but where the strength really comes in is in their ability to mitigate damage through various tools. Many of the utility features of the Monk look a bit different than what you might see from other classes, but if you're considering the class on its own, you'll notice that you have tools for most situations and can comfortably navigate any situation. Moving on to the usability of the class, in general, I would say that the class feels fantastic. If you enjoy the challenge of a dynamic and slightly complex playstyle, the Monk will be a very fun class for you. You should be aware that all the specs require a bit of rewiring in your brain, since it does not really feel like most other classes that we're used to at this point. Due to the high skill ceiling of the class, it can become a bit daunting for most players since the gameplay is a bit punishing when you make mistakes, but it does feel great when you manage to do the right thing. On an overall level, we'll have our hands full with the newest class. If played correctly, the Monk will show some great promise in most content, but can fall short in most categories while learning. Once you get the hang of the class, I would assume that the Monk is going to be viable in all scenarios and will be a staple pick in most group content. Next, let's take a look at the Warrior. The Warrior is seeing a bit of a comeback this expansion. Not in terms of representation, since we've had the Arms Warrior in most PvE groups before, but rather in the other specs that are now getting some love. The playstyle of the Warrior is going to be very similar to what it has been in the past, with the major change being that the stance dancing is no longer as potent and should be less of a barrier to play efficiently. Also, the Warrior is getting some huge upgrades in terms of group additions with the new banner system and some class-specific cooldowns which will add a great deal of value to any group. In terms of performance, the Warrior is seeing a bit of a come up from Cataclysm. As of right now, the Prot Warrior is looking like a very solid pick for tanking in early MoP with high levels of damage and very strong cooldowns. Both DPS specs are also looking like strong picks in terms of damage, and it would be expected to continue going forward. It's hard to say much other than the Warrior class is looking like a high performing class across the board. When it comes to the complexity of the class, all of the specs are on a high level of complexity on a comparative scale. By looking at the standard rotation of all specs, the amount of spells which are included to reach high performers are quite a few, so you need to be comfortable with a wide toolkit. However, the difference to some other complex classes is that the Warrior specs have a low variety of buff and debuff management, so the majority of the complexity comes through the standard rotations themselves. In terms of utility, the Warrior gets some fantastic additions compared to previous expansions. While being a mobile class with new additions to all specs, we also see some targeted external cooldowns and other raid buffs which will greatly increase the tool that the Warrior brings to any group. More specifically, Vigilance, being a handsack type of external, paired with the new banner system, is going to put the Warrior at a high grade when it comes to utility, and it would be expected that most PvE groups bring at least one Warrior due to this. Moving on to the usability of the class, in general I would say that the class feels very smooth. The days of castbar slam usage and stance dancing is over, and the new rotations feel like they have been streamlined by quite a lot. If we were to look at the immense amount of spells and tools which a Warrior brings, it's not for the faint of heart. There are a lot of abilities and other tools which you need to use effectively when playing Warrior in order to realize your potential, and it can be a handful for any new players. However, even when played at an intermediate level, the class doesn't feel very punishing, which makes it a good pick regardless of your experience with the class. On an overall level, MoP is going to be another good expansion for the Warriors. The Protection and Fury specs are brought back from out of the shadows of Cataclysm, and we can expect the class to be a strong pick for most solo and group content. The wide array of tools and rewarding gameplay makes it a solid recommendation for main class for anyone who's still on the fence of what to play. Next, let's talk about the Death Knight. In similar fashion to other expansions, the DK is looking to be a powerhouse of a class.
The class design has been widely untouched and pays homage to the traditional DK playstyle. If you've played DK in the past, you should feel right at home in MoP, since the class playstyle does not really change apart from some new spell additions and streamlining of talents. It's the class that needs no introduction, so let's dive straight into the factor analysis. In terms of performance, you're looking at a top tier class across the board. As a tank, the BDK tops the charts in single target encounters and has fantastic HPS. When it comes to the two DPS specs, we're currently seeing that Unholy is pulling slightly ahead, but since the last Frost buffs, both of the specs are performing at a top tier level with some great numbers when played correctly. In many scenarios, the DK casts a huge shadow on its competition and is once again looking like a very strong pick for any setting. When it comes to the complexity, it's a bit tricky. DK is one of those classes that can be min-maxed to absurdity, so the skill ceiling is very high. However, for both Frost and Blood, there's a large margin for error where you can go in at a beginner level and still do some good numbers with very little effort. On the other hand, the Unholy spec is a bit more punishing for rookie mistakes. In order to post good numbers on the Unholy, you need to be comfortable with the class playstyle and snapshotting efficiently, so in this department the complexity rises a bit since you'll be managing power levels off your debuffs while juggling dual resources. In terms of utility, the DK has historically only really had AMZ as utility when an Unholy spec and not much else that they bring to a group. But with the new talent system, we're seeing some relief for our class as a whole. We get some much needed mobility as well as a raid cooldown across all specs. Despite these changes, the utility grade of the DK is low. You'll definitely see some value in a group setting from having a DK, but it's currently in the shadow of the other classes with a much wider toolkit. Having established that the skill ceiling is high and can cater to min-maxing needs, how does it look on the lower side of scale in terms of usability? In general, all three specs will be great in most settings, and both Frost and Blood have a very simple rotation to it, with low punishment for bad play, which can make it a user-friendly pickup. Unholy is a bit different, as it will be very punishing for bad spell usage and if the player is on the newer side of the class. It's worth considering that the DK's dual resource system is probably among the hardest resource systems to use among any class due to the dynamic elements of death runes, which sometimes changes your rotational priority. All things considered, I would say that the DK is an easy pickup and rewards players even at a low level with a lot of room to grow. On an overall level, MoP is going to be another great expansion for DKs. The previous BDK meta might shift a bit when it comes to raiding, and it's not because BDKs has gotten any less potent, but just due to the fact that all other tanks have had their standard raised and are now competitive choices. The state of the DPS specs are brought a bit more out of the light this time around, and the class in general is expected to be a very well-rounded and high-performing class. Next, let's move on to the Priest. The Priest has been nicely refined going into MoP, with enhancements to the familiar aspects of the class from the past, and remains a cornerstone of support gameplay. The core structure remains intact, but we see some new additions which makes it feel a bit more engaging to play. The class is still very purpose-driven, with each spec having a particular role to fill. Let's talk a bit about the performance of the Priest. In terms of raw output, the Disc Priest is looking particularly strong due to their playstyle of big absorptions and damage output. This spec style has been further amped going into MoP with the new Spirit Shell ability, and Atonement has been buffed quite a bit. The Holy Priest has gotten a bit of a facelift from the past with the new Chakra synergies where they excel at AoE healing but do fairly well in other aspects as well. However, the spec is still on the weaker side compared to its Disc counterpart. The Shadow spec retains its cleave potential by multi-dotting and does great in prolonged fights. They do tend to drop off in the short bursty department, but can be expected to be good performers in fights with more than one target. The complexity of the class is considered to be high in general, as all specs have certain elements of difficulty to them. Disc requires good encounter predictability in order to properly know when to use mitigative measures and when to DPS. Also, the wide assortment of impactful tools will be a tall hill to climb in order to optimize the usage, but the core rotation is fairly simple. The Holy spec is also pretty easy when it comes to rotation and feels quite intuitive. However, due to the chakra stances and cooldowns, you'll need to swap your rotation based on which chakra you're using to optimize your kit. Finally, the Shadow Priest is quite hard to master and feels punishing when performing at a subpar level. You'll need to sequence your cooldown and resources properly while maintaining a tight grip on your dot op time, making it a multifaceted spec which requires some experience. In terms of utility, the Priest is at a good level. The amount of supported features to group content compete with the best of the best, having strong cooldowns such as Barrier, Pain Sup, and Divine Hymn depending on your specialization. There are also some additions to the mobility department which are severely needed. In general, if you can stomach the amount of available buttons playing Priest, you're in for a treat in terms of utility. Moving on to the usability of the class, I would say that it's a bit tricky whether or not to pick up Priest. If you're committed to playing the class and have the determination to commit to it, you will be rewarded greatly. However, if you intend on playing the class every now and then, it might be a bit of a disappointment. While the off-spec potential is great, all of the unique specs will require significant mastery in order to perform, and it's not an easy pickup however effective it might be. If you were to commit to playing Priest, you should expect that you will be a priority pick for most content, as most groups will benefit from having a Priest on board. On an overall level, the Priest retains its cornerstone position as a support class and does go through some overhaul and refinement, which makes it feel smoother than before. Shadow gets some nice quality of life changes to their Shadow Orbs and mobility, but retains a strong position from Cataclysm as a solid DPS class, especially on multi-target fights. If you were to pick up a Priest, I would suggest that you start practicing, since you'll need some hours to get to an efficient level. Next, let's talk about the Shaman. The Shaman gets some serious polishing going into MoP, specifically through the rotational flow, talent flexibility, and spec identity. Totems are no longer persistent by default, but will rather be an on-demand use, enhancing the strategic aspect of totem usage. They also get very strong cooldowns for group content, and are looking like they are building on their previous momentum from Cataclysm. In terms of performance, the Shaman is looking like it's going to be mid to high tier performer. The Resto spec was a strong pick in 25-man content in Cataclysm, and will look to extend that dominant performance down to the 10-man bracket in MoP. With the addition of some strong cooldowns from totems, and not being solely reliant on everyone camping in your healing rain, the Resto Shaman is looking like a top tier performer for most group content. The Elemental and Enhancement classes are in a slightly worse spot, but are still somewhere in the middle of the pack. The specs get a bit more bursty due to the addition of some strong cooldowns, being Ascendance, Stormlash Totem, and Elemental Blast, which breaks the previous monotony of the spec. The complexity of the class is pretty low. For Elemental, the snapshotting aspect has been removed, which basically allows you to go through a very simple rotation while looking for lava burst procs. Enhancement is in a bit of the same state, where the core gameplay loop from Cataclysm is kept intact, with minor changes, but due to snapshotting being changed, the spec does become quite simplified. Resto has a very similar feel, where AoE settings will favor Unleash Element healing rains and chain heals, and single target will be your use of wave spells off tidal wave stacks. While all specs feel quite simple, the complexity is raised a bit by the wide assortment of utility spells and cooldowns being brought in by the talent system, but it should still remain at a fairly easy level to play. In terms of utility, the Shamans are at a great level. The previous totem system has now become an array of cooldowns, and we get some of the strongest CDs in the game through our totems. Since these are accessible to all specs, with the exception of Spirit Link, the impact is quite significant across the board. While there was not really any big buttons to press in the past, all specs now have several cooldowns, such as Elemental Blast, Stormlash Totems, Ascendance, or Elemental Mastery, which adds some nuance to the class. These additions make the Shaman one of the top classes in the utility department, and will bring a lot of value to all groups. Moving on to the usability of the class, I would argue that the Shaman is a very easy class to pick up, despite having a lot of utility to use. The main reason is that the standard rotations and resource systems are very simple, so your biggest degree of freedom will be to manage your cooldowns, which feels very intuitive. While the performance is not stunning, the off-spec potential for the Shaman is great, and the utility kit itself will make Shamans a popular contender for roster spots. On an overall level, the Shaman sees some nice changes coming their way. A big hurdle in the past was that they had a 3-button rotation, and it became very dull to play. Most of this has changed, and we can expect to see some more engaging and fluent gameplay going into MoP. In addition, the supportive features of the Shaman really makes them shine in group content, and will be a solid pickup when choosing any class. Next, let's take a look at the Hunter. Hunters are getting a bit of a modernization going into MoP. A big change from the past is that we no longer have a melee stat stick, but rather rely entirely on our ranged weapons, as the minimum range requirements on spells is completely removed. Resource flow feels more fluent, and the class has received some nice cooldowns which makes them feel more dynamic in how you play. The pet management system has also seen an overhaul with less need of micromanagement. The pets no longer have a static spec, meaning that any pet can produce the same amount of damage, and your choice of pet will instead be dependent on what buffs it brings to the table. In terms of performance, the Hunter started the beta with an absolute banger performance. However, during the pre-patch, we've seen some normalization compared to other classes where the playing field among DPS classes is now much more even. By the current balancing, both Survival and Marksman are posting competitive numbers with the best specs and should be a top performer. Beast Mastery is off to a bit of a slow start, and while it does have strong burst profile, it's projected to scale better into the latter portions of the expansion. The complexity of the class is fairly low. All specs have a streamlined resource system with a rotation consisting of very few abilities. In MoP, we do see the addition of one of the most needed changes for hunters being the lack of significant cooldowns. Adding these to our standard rotation will change things slightly, but still keep it at a simple level to pick up. In terms of utility, the hunters are not great. While the class gets some movement and crowd control mechanics, this is seldom something that's valued in group content. However, if we were to look at the solo content or even PvP, this grade might look a bit different. The biggest utility benefit from the Hunter really comes from its pets. Since the pet damage is normalized and you can play with any pet you want, it would more or less come down to what pet brings in terms of buffs. MoP does have a bit fewer raid buffs to cover, but at the same time there are fewer classes that bring something to the table. In short, the Hunters will be able to grant most raid buffs which a group might want, and could be a priority pick due to their flexibility in providing these. Moving on to the usability of the class, the Hunter is fairly simple to play, and performs decent even at a beginner level of use, which rewards new players in picking it up and learning the Hunter ways. Most groups will benefit from having a Hunter, since the performance does tend to reach the higher levels and it brings a lot of buff potential to groups, which is highly valued in smaller content. The gameplay loop has gotten a bit more engaging than it was in the past, with the addition of some offensive cooldowns and rotational abilities such as Glaive Toss. These changes address the previous pain points of the Hunter, and it feels quite refined this time around. On an overall level, the Hunter should be a secure pick in most group content due to the raid buffs which it brings. It's expected to perform fairly well, be easy to pick up for new players, and be engaging to play. In short, if you're unsure about what to play yet, I would expect that the Hunter could be something for you. Next, let's take a look at the Mage. The Mage enters MoP with a few core adjustments that reinforce spec identity while streamlining its core gameplay. The new talent system allows for more utility-focused options rather than throughput, but generally the class will feel fairly similar to what it has in the past. We see some balancing, which allows for a bit more spec flexibility, and Fire Mages are now dethroned by the other less popular specs. If you previously wanted to play Arcane or Frost Mage in PvE, this might just be the expansion for you, since we're seeing a come up in these aspects. In terms of performance, the Mage is surprisingly not as dominant as it tends to be. While the class is expected to scale well into the later parts of the expansion, it starts off at a pretty high level while not a standout performer. From the current balancing, it's looking like Arcane and Frost are doing some solid numbers, while Fire lags a bit behind. The complexity of the class is on the low side. While the rotational aspects of the class are very straightforward, that does imply that you need to min-max your spell usage to get to a high level of performance. The Fire spec has been severely streamlined, with Combustion being less of an RNG fest since Ignite is built through flat damage dealt in your Mastery kit and it's no longer crit based. The amount of buff or debuff monitoring is fairly low, and could be quite rewarding even when played at a beginner level. In terms of utility, the Mage is really not great. The majority of utility comes from their defensives and mobility, which sets them on the far lower end of utility brought to group content. In terms of crowd control, we do see some strong utility which can be more well suited in solo or PvP scenarios, but the utility brought to group content is deemed to be less significant. Moving on to the usability of the class, I would argue that the Mage is a very viable pick despite its lack of utility and lack of dynamic elements to the gameplay. While it performs at a high level, the barrier of entry is quite low, and it can be a solid pickup for most players who's new to the class. On an overall level, the Mage has dropped a bit in terms of its previous powerhouse status. The The Frost and Arcane specs are dethroning Fire from being the best spec, which can be a nice change of pace from Cataclysm. Arguably, the Mage is proving to be the simplest of all caster specs and could be a great pickup for anyone who's unsure what to pick despite being new to the class if you want to fill that caster role. Next, let's talk about the Warlock. The Warlock lies around the top of the most changed classes going into MoP. If you were previously deterred from playing Warlock by having 2-minute pull timers and a dozen buttons to monitor and press before the fight even starts, you might want to reconsider picking up the lock. The most notable change during the pre-patch is that the whole situation of pre-pull shenanigans is basically non-existent. Also, Affliction and Destruction are making a comeback, such that you are not shoehorned into playing Demo for the class to be viable. The introduction of Demonic Fury and Burning Embers resources completely change how the specs manage damage and cooldowns, and there might be a bit of a new learning curve to get back into playing Warlock. We now see that each spec has a very distinctly tailored rotation, with additions from the homogenized talent system, which brings some utility to both solo and group content. In terms of performance, the Warlock is showing strong numbers. It's primarily the Destro and Affliction specs which are popping off, with Affliction having more promise towards the latter parts of the expansion. Demo has been put into the shadows of the other specs and is not performing as well, but could still be viable if there are any spec enjoys left from Cataclysm. A big performance boost for the Affliction lock comes from the ability to snapshot your dots and then transfer them between targets with Soul Swap, such that you refresh the duration and can keep strong dots up throughout the multi-target fights. The Demo spec requires a lot of setup, but can pull up some great numbers, specifically in AoE fights depending on how you prepare, with CDs going into the fight. Finally, Destruction has leaned hard into the more traditional caster style, with consistent damage over time and the possibility to have strong cleave due to Havoc. The complexity of the class is high across the board. The Affliction is in a state where you must get strong dots and transfer them to keep them active in order to compete, which requires a lot of aura management, something which can be a daunting task for new players. Demonology is a bit similar to before, with a requirement to manage your cooldowns effectively, and proper sequencing is a must while managing your Demonic Fury within Metamorphosis. Destro, on the other hand, is a bit simpler. While we do see the introduction of a new resource system being the Burning Embers, the traditional caster style rotation shines through, and it can be quite rewarding even at a beginner level. In terms of utility, the Warlocks are somewhere in the middle by bringing Dark Intent as a raid buff, health stones, summoning portals, and the usual gist. In general, the class strength comes from its potency in combat, and utility is not the primary contributing factor in group content. While this is true for most cases, the utility that the Warlock does bring is quite potent, and can assist in a lot of the group content in question. Moving on to the usability of the class, the Warlock is a bit of a tough one. The off-spec viability throughout the expansion is fantastic, and you can easily swap between specs to suit the encounter needs. However, the level of mastery needed to perform in most specs is quite high, and it can be hard for new players to adapt. While the standard rotations are quite complex, there's also an assortment of cooldowns which needs to be monitored and sequenced properly, which makes it a tall order for anyone who's new. On an overall level, the Warlock is coming into another expansion as a top performing DPS class in group content. You can expect most groups to use a Warlock for the group benefits, but also for the sheer throughput that it provides. While some streamlining has been made to the toolkit of the class, and the barrier of entry has been lowered, it's still quite a challenge to get solid performance, but it is truly rewarding when you commit to it. Finally, let's talk about the Rogue. The Rogue is in a similar state as it has been in the past. The changes to the class feel more like modernization changes than changes to the core mechanics of the class, so it should feel pretty similar to what it has before. The pacing of the class has been improved, where we get nice additions to AoE scenarios in terms of damage output and combo point generation, compared to what's been available before. Also, the poison system has been simplified, such that it now acts as buffs instead of consumables on your weapons. In terms of performance, the Rogue looks fairly similar to what it has been in Cataclysm. The Rogue had a rough start to the beta, posting subpar numbers, but looking at the current balancing, it's making a climb towards the top. It's expected to be a high-performing class in both single and cleave scenarios, with some reservation of scaling not being the best, or that things might change come launch. When it comes to the complexity, all of the specs are on a medium level of complexity. The resource management itself is quite streamlined for the Rogue and MoP, but as any combo point based spec, it's a constant trade-off of generating more combo points, having enough energy for upcoming CDs, and not overcapping resources. By looking at the standard rotation of all specs, the amount of spells which are included to reach high performance are quite a few, so you need to be comfortable with a wide toolkit. However, the difference to some other complex classes is that the specs have a low variety of buff and debuff management, so the majority of the complexity comes through the standard rotation itself. In addition, the combat rogue gets a reduced GCD when using Adrenaline Rush, which really emphasizes correct ability usage on a short notice. In terms of utility, the rogue is somewhere in the middle of the pack, pulling towards the lower parts. The rogue's niche kit, which primarily revolves around mobility and crowd control, is not really favored in group content. However, in MoP the smoke bomb ability becomes a raid cooldown which mitigates damage, and they will see some value in a group setting. Moving on to the usability of the class, in general I would say that the rogues are at a decent level. The flow of the rotation feels smooth, and it's quite an easy pickup for most players. While it does not feel a huge gap in terms of group additions, it can pull some big numbers which will require proper sequencing and rotational control. On an overall level, rogues offer high performance when played correctly, but does not bring a lot to groups apart from their numbers. In a coordinated PvE group, the lack of utility might force groups to pass on the rogue for other more beneficiary classes, but it can bring some solid value if you were to pick it up. Apart from this, it's a pretty easy pickup, so if you're still on the fence on which melee DPS to pick, the rogue could be a fun option for you. With the class by class factor analysis out of the way, it's time to shift focus and look at the bigger picture. In the upcoming segment, I'm gonna share my take on the classes grouped by role. Based on my own testing and analysis of current balancing, I'll place the classes on a comparative scale. I'm not a big fan of traditional tier lists, but I know that many of you appreciate a relative comparison, especially if you haven't had time to try every class out for yourself. Let's start off by looking at the tanks. MoP brings some nice changes to tanking in general, not just to their survivability, but also their impact offensively and strategically. And no, I'm not going to talk about the Vengeance changes, but instead I'll talk about how all tanks now have an active mitigation system as a part of their core rotation. Due to this, the tank role has become a bit more demanding, since players are more or less needed to push the uptime of their active mitigation in order to stay healthy while weaving in damage and utility. The assumption for this comparison is going to be that you're able to play the class on an intermediate to high level, because the complexity of the classes can shift the alignment at lower levels. So who are the winners in the tanking department? I would say that the biggest winner of all is going to be the Brewmaster, as it pulls ahead in most scenarios over the other tanks in early stages of MoP. Its fantastic mitigative measures, mobility, damage, and supportive features solidifies it as a staple pick among the tanks. Falling just behind are the BDK, Prot Warrior, and Prot Paladin. While all of these tanks are showing great performance, I wouldn't say that they're on the same level as the Brewmaster, despite falling very closely behind in all aspects. We'll still see the BDK topping single target encounters and Prot Warriors being great at surviving during progression, but it's not as all-round as the Brewmaster. Drawing the shortest straw is going to be the Guardian Druid. Long story short, the Guardian is severely underperforming and is looking like a weak pick in most aspects of play. Due to its poor performance, I would expect some tweaking going into launch, but we could see it rise to power with higher gear levels later in the expansion. Let's move on by talking about the healers. MoP is shaping up to be a nice expansion for healing classes, with redesigned mana management, stronger spec identity, and clearer healing niches. Some healers lean heavier into throughput, while others rely on their ability to mitigate damage and their utility toolkits. We also see the addition of another DPSing healer, which further solidifies the niche healer identities available. While the healers are very group dependent, we can see two standout classes at this stage, being the Discipline Priest and the Restoration Shaman. The niches between these specs differ a bit, with the Disc Priest being a mitigative machine and the Resto Shaman pumping big HPS. The common denominator is that both specs have fantastic utility and are really good within their particular niche. Let's not forget that the Disc Priest is able to pump some serious DPS with their Atonement kit. Not too far from the top, we see Resto Druids and Mistweaver Monks coming in as solid pickups for much of the same reasons. The Resto Druid is an HPS machine and the Mistweaver can deal some great damage similar to the Disc Priest. However, neither of these classes bring the same level of utility as the top picks and are therefore pushed out of the top in my comparison. Looking at the lower portion of the comparative scale, I've placed Holy Paladin and Holy Priest as the weakest specs among the healers. I might have bumped the HPAL up to the middle bracket due to their amazing utility kit which they bring, but since the throughput outside of AoE healing is a bit weak, I put them at the bottom as the other classes outshine them slightly. The Holy Priest is in a bit of the same scenario as the HPAL, but is comparatively worse in the utility department, landing at the bottom of the scale. Next, let's talk about the range DPS classes. If you intend on playing range DPS and MoP, you have a lot of really solid picks and the meta will shift as we progress through the tiers. In general, MoP introduces more dynamic encounters, which can be perceived to be slightly beneficial to range DPS compared to their melee counterparts. Many classes will excel with the addition of class-specific utility and the additions of cooldowns which can be timed for beneficial use. Due to the amounts of class available, I won't go into too much detail, but rather just give you an indication of how I see things on a comparative scale. My top picks for the range DPS will be Survival Hunter, Destruction Warlock, and Frost Mage. While this might not be a completely accurate picture of the power rankings, all of these classes are posting fantastic numbers and are expected to see some very competitive performance. Additionally, the classes are fairly easy to play, while simultaneously giving a lot of bang for the buck, earning them a top spot on the list. In the middle bracket, I've placed Arcane Mages, MM Hunters, LA Shamans, Affliction Warlocks, Shadow Priests, and Boomies. While there is solid performance to be found here, LA Shamans shine through their utility kit and can be brought out of the shadows due to this. Affliction, Shadow, and Balance are all great picks in multi-target fights, but do tend to fall short otherwise. It should be noted that all of these specs are still viable, but are slightly underperforming in some departments of use. Falling a bit short is going to be the BM Hunters, Fire Mages, and Demo Locks. While these specs do bring their own merits, they can simply not compete with the other specs on the list, which earns them a low grade on a comparative scale. Finally, let's talk about the melee DPS. MoP continues the trend of fast-paced and tightly windowed melee gameplay. Many specs are similar to what they have been in the past, but we do seek design overhauls in terms of their new talents. We can expect the melee DPS to bring a lot of helpful utility and potent burst as a key factor going into this expansion. The top of my list will contain the Unholy Death Knight and Arms Warrior. Both of these classes are posting some great numbers, with the DK pulling slightly ahead. The Warrior compensates by bringing some of the best group utility in the game and can be expected to be a standard pick for all groups. The middle of the pack will include the Windwalker Monk, all rogue classes, Frost Death Knight, and Red Paladins. While all of these specs have niche uses, the drop-off in either great performance or additions to group content pull them down from the upper parts of the scale. However, it should be noted that you will see representation from several of these classes in upper tier gameplay. The lower portion of the scale will include Fury Warriors, Feral Druids, and Enhancement Shamans. While the expected performance is close to the other specs, someone has to be at the bottom, right? The biggest reason for placing them at the bottom is simply due to having better off specs or by not being able to fit in standard meta comps. And that's gonna wrap up my role comparison. As a final segment, which are my top picks going into this expansion? To keep it thematic, I'll show my picks for each role before we wrap this video up. Among the tanks, I couldn't help myself from making two picks, being the Brewmaster and Prot Paladin. Since both classes are looking like top performers, the answer seems pretty obvious, but my reasoning is a bit different. The main reason for these being top picks is due to the fact that they feel incredibly smooth to play. Their rotations and wide assortment of abilities to use in various scenarios make them a standout pick, which I think will be enjoyable for many hours to come. Among the healers, I'm really excited to see the Resto Druid in action. Despite not being placed at the top of my list, I suspect that the Resto Druid will be somewhat of a sleeper pick, even in smaller group compositions. Through the addition of Ironbark as an external, as well as some nice quality of life features to the hot play style, the spec feels fluent and strong, while still providing a challenge for the user. Among the range DPS, I'm keeping it a bit generic and saying the Destro Warlock. While it's a bit of an obvious pick, the Destro is going to be very strong at launch, and it's quite refreshing to get the Warlock back to a more traditional caster style. I expect that the new resource system paired with the dominant performers will keep us engaged for a long time. Finally, among the melee DPS, I'm gonna pick the Feral Druid. Despite being a bit biased, I'm really excited to see the Feral become a potent DPS spec and not constantly be perceived as an off-tank. The changes made to Feral have made the spec quite fun to play, where the single target is similar to what it has been before, with added degrees of complexity, but the AoE has gotten significantly stronger. With their new balancing, the Feral is looking like it can perform competitively with most other classes on single target fights, which is a nice change of pace. And that's gonna wrap up my class picking guide for the MoP launch. I'm really excited for the launch of MoP and all the new content coming our way. Within the near future, I'm gonna post more content, such as class guides, as well as a UI and add-ons guide, so make sure to drop a subscription so you don't miss out. This video took me really long time to make, so if it helped you out, make sure to leave a like on the video and comment your thoughts as we're approaching the launch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.